Okay. Well, thanks everybody. Welcome again to the latest Chiefly Conversation. I'd like to start by acknowledging that where I am zooming from is Gadigal land of the Eora Nation, and I'll pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge that wherever you are on Indigenous land that's never been ceded. So welcome to this, the seventh of our Chiefly Conversations throughout this strange time we're going through. And as regular attendees know, what we've done with these Chiefly Conversations, we're really trying to have a conversation that goes beyond the immediate needs of the coronavirus crisis towards a sort of social democratic future that we want to create in Australia and around the world. And I think that today's topic goes straight to the heart of that debate. For those of us who've still been in work, enforced lockdowns in response to COVID-19 have dramatically affected the way we've worked, what we could do with our leisure time, how we've travelled, even how we've begun to relate to our families and friends and our wider communities. So is this going to be the new normal? Will we ever go back to the way things were? Do we even want to go back to the way things were? So they're the sort of questions that we really want to have as we discuss this topic of Brave New World today. And what a fantastic and amazing panel we've got who have joined us today for this conversation. We've got distinguished Professor Genevieve Bell, the of the 3A Institute and the Florence Violet Mackenzie Chair at the Australian National University, as well as Vice President and Senior Fellow at Intel Corporation. We've got Dr. Andrew Leigh MP, the Shadow Assistant Minister for Treasury and Charities, as well as author of Way Too Many Books for Me to Count. We've got Caitlin Fitzsimmons, Senior Writer for the Sun Herald and the Sydney Morning Herald, and last but not least, Gabriel Metcalfe, the CEO for the Committee to Sydney. So welcome everybody. Welcome to everyone else on the Zoom group chat. Thanks for joining us. As always, for those who don't know, haven't been with us, we have a chat function going. Please feel free to pop comments into the chat function, questions, whatever. We can draw questions out from the audience to put to our panelists. And we are recording, so those of you with your videos on, and it's great to see so many videos on so we can see who we're talking to. Don't do anything you don't want recorded for posterity, I guess. Anyway, I'm going to start with a general question to the panel, and then we'll go into deeper issues. I guess, and I'll start with you, Genevieve, and then we'll go around the horn. What do you think have been the biggest permanent changes to the way we live and to the way we work arising from this crisis and how we've reacted to it?
Listen, I think it's a really good question, Brett. And for me, I think it's less about a change and more about a thing that's been made visible in a way that I don't think had been up until now, which is really about how intensely clear I think it is to almost everyone, the network that we have built around us and how unstable it is. And I think for many Australians, this is actually a continuity of a lesson we learned over the summer. I think if you think about the way the bushfires unfolded in, well, really late November, January, February, and December too, what we started to see was a whole series of infrastructures I think we took for granted in the 20th century that we always talk about building the 21st century on: electricity, telecommunications, roads, even water, our finance systems, all turned out to be much more brittle than we'd anticipated. You know, whether it was water systems failing, electrical systems failing, the grid kind of grinding down, notions about telecommunications. I think we came out of this last summer, particularly in Australia, acutely aware of how fragile the world was that we were operating in. And my suspicion is that the biggest change for the last 3 months is suddenly having to be much more aware, and I think for some people a quite confronting way, about where does your stuff come from? Like, where does the toilet paper come from? Where does the pasta come from? Where does the mail come from? Who is the post person who delivers things to your door? How do people get to Australia and from Australia? And I think the whole kind of globalized world that had just been ticking along feels over the last 6 months, at least to me, to be both intensely more visible and intensely more fragile. So I think if there's a lasting change, it's that we can no longer pretend you can just build a future on the present and think it's going to work. So it's more an idea change, I think.
Thanks, Genevieve. Caitlin?
Well, building on that point, I think that there's going to be a movement for nations to try to be more self-sufficient, for Australia to try to build that self-sufficiency. So there's been talk for a long time about how you can have distributed manufacturing and the promise of things like 3D printing and laser cutting and small agile kind of manufacturing. I think there's going to be a lot more experimentation with that. I'm hearing kind of things moving up the chain in terms of raw materials being made in Australia as well. And because we are going to have disruptions to global trade for some time, there's going to be time for that to kind of start to evolve and pan out into a new reality. Where it goes long term is uncertain, but I think there'll be moves in that direction. And I think just with the way individuals live, there'll be a lot of people not going back to the office, or not going back to the office as many days as they were before. I think there is, there is value in being around colleagues and having collaboration. I don't think everything can be at home all the time, but commuting is not fun for most people, and the bigger our cities get and more expensive real estate gets, the longer commuting has to be. So for people to be able to work from home and reduce that kind of conflict between work and family, I think they'll be quite resistant to returning to the old norms, especially while public transport potentially remains a source of infection.
Right. Yeah. I really want to get into this idea of cities and the future of cities. Absolutely. I think it's really focusing our minds on whether density is in fact destiny. But before we get into that, I'll go to Andrew on this general point, and then Gabriel as well.
Well, thanks, Brett, and can I acknowledge the Ngunnawal people on whose lands I'm meeting today. Let me start with an unusual point from an economist. I think it's taught us a lot about social capital. I do a podcast called The Good Life, and occasionally interview people who've worked in hospices and had those end-of-life conversations. And they say that what really matters at the end of your life isn't the amount of money you've got or the number of things on your CV, it's your health and your connections with family. I think the pandemic really reinforced for many Australians the importance of health and the importance of family, and also the strength of our civic ties. We often imagine that when adversity hits that society is going to fall apart, but actually I think we saw the opposite. For all of the chatter on evening news about fights in supermarkets over toilet paper, the big story for me of Australian communities was the way in which people reached out to their friends and neighbours, built new civic groups, created organisations and strengthened solidarity in a time of anxiety. It's a mistake people have made throughout history. You go right back to World War II when Hitler thought that bombing London would destroy the spirit of Londoners, and in fact he ended up strengthening it. I think too our social ties have been strengthened, and the challenge now is how to use that to build a civic renaissance, because we have gone through a couple of generations now of declining social capital, in which we've seen a drop-off in Scouts, Guides, Rotary, Lions, churches, unions, many of the volunteering organisations as well. So reconnecting Australia in the spirit of Catherine Barrett's Kindness Pandemic Facebook page, celebrating our connectedness and finding new ways to connect is for me the best thing that could possibly come out of this terrible pandemic.
Thanks, Andrew. Yeah, that's another great topic I want to get into. Even the, I don't know if people have seen it, the bin isolation outing Facebook page, where people have been celebrating their shared humanity by putting out their rubbish bins, I think has been fantastic during this time too. Gabriel, this I guess meta question for you first, and then we'll really dig into some of these really excellent meaty issues that have been exposed by our conversation already.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for having me here. So this question, what changes are permanent? Well, of course, the honest answer is we don't know yet. And it's really early in the process. And it probably depends a lot on how much longer this goes on, how bad it gets. And I think it really depends a lot on whether this is the first of many pandemics, as people like Bill Gates have predicted, or if it's a long time till we have another pandemic that gets out of control like this. If this is one-off, I think a lot of societies might end up reverting to as close as they can get to the way things were. My perspective on this is very influenced by being an American, and feeling incredibly lucky to be spending this time in Australia. And I think some societies may really get to the brink of a collapse as a result of their failure to manage COVID. But Australia, of course, is the opposite. It is feeling so proud of itself for how well it's managed it. In some ways, you could even say that for a lot of people, it's an appreciation of things that were taken for granted, like just kind of competent government, science, things that you never thought could be so important. But then you compare Australia to places like America. I actually think that could end up being quite a force for conservatism in Australia, a feeling that, Nate, at least we're not America.
Fantastic, thank you. I want to now talk about, I guess, this role of cities and the role of office work, and where we go with that. I mean, you know, for cities have been a great driver of economic growth, particularly high density cities over the last couple of 100 years. In fact, one of the biggest drivers of economic growth there is. But, you know, we've all, those of us, as I say, lucky enough to have still be in work, particularly white collar workers, we've got used to this Zooming, this being here at home, doing these sort of meetings, not going into the city. I had to go into the CBD yesterday, which was the first time I had been there since March the 3rd. And I have no intention to go back if I don't have to. And I think a lot of people feel that way. So, you know, I'll start with you, Gabriel, because you're the CEO of the Committee for Sydney. And part of that is about the whole of Sydney, but it's also about how Sydney, you know, economic growth and how we make Sydney work better. I mean, do you think with this way we've changed the way we're working, whether we have seen sort of, I don't know, the end of the city, the end of CBD, as it were?
Yeah, it's a great question. Look, the conventional wisdom is that in the future, there is going to be a mix where going to the office happens, but less often. People work from home more, which means they will get to live farther away from the office if they choose. And I don't probably have anything so different to say to that conventional wisdom. That seems right. I'm not so sure that's a good outcome. I think it's mixed. It depends on who you are. I think we are, in fact, spending down a lot of cultural capital of being together. And I think for a year or two, many organizations are going to see productivity increases from not doing meetings and not wasting time chatting at the water cooler. But it's all of the unplanned interactions that you don't schedule, all the people you don't have a specific purpose to talk to that are going away in this new world. And I think those actually might be valuable. They might turn out to be quite important. I also worry a lot about younger people. The way you learn to talk on the phone is listening to the boss talk on the phone. It's that absorbing of how people are in the environment, that sort of tacit mentoring that I think is getting lost. So again, yeah, a year or two working remotely, no one will notice any downsides to that, perhaps, if you're lucky enough to have an office job that lets you do that. But in the long run, I don't know. I think we are going to embark on that experiment, and we will find out. We'll find out if it matters or not. If in the long run, people really do work remotely in greater numbers, it could be really a renaissance for places like Newcastle, a bit too far from Sydney to do a daily commute, but a really great city that people would love to live in. I think CBDs in that scenario will end up having to be repurposed. They have many assets, historic buildings and public spaces and great architecture and a sort of concentration of urban energy. If people really don't go back to work the way they did before, some of that space will, of course, have to get converted to residential or other uses, which would be not the end of cities, but the reinvention of cities.
Caitlin, you've done a bit of writing on this stuff too, and I just saw in the chat a comment from my chair, Linda White, talking about a tweet she saw that said, "Working from home is more like living at work." Now, I think that probably is true for a lot of people in the last 3 months. But what's your take on this, and the future of cities, and and as you said, public transport? How do we retool that? What are we looking at? You're still on mute. Sorry.
Classic Zoom moment. I do agree that there are benefits when people are together in an office, and there's a lot of research into clustering effect and the creativity that comes from inadvertent collaboration, the conversations that happen in the hallways, and so on. And I think that's all very true. And I'm also worried about younger people. I mean, I think I can do my job as effectively from home as from the office. It's made no difference at all. I have had to go out to some events, but I can do that from home just as much as I can from the office. But thinking back to when I was at the start of my career, and the mentoring and the kind of informal guidance and modelling that I could see from watching people around me, it's hard to replicate that in a digital form. So I think it's a good point that we might not see the effects straight away, but there will be some negative effects as well. Having said that, I think we are embarking on this experiment because I think a lot of people really do like working from home, and a lot of people are rightly depending on their own circumstances or even just in general worried about public transport, worried about being in an office, worried about having to be two at a time in a lift up to the 44th floor if they're in a skyscraper. So I think there's going to be a lot more people from working from home, and I think that will change. If that goes on long term, it does change our cities. It changes. People pay a premium to live close to the city, but that may no longer be the case. I guess what I miss the most, and what I think hope comes back, is the cultural life that comes from having kind of density in a city. And obviously the arts industry is very much closed for business at the moment, and we don't know when that's going to reopen, but I think that could be affected in the long term by loss of density as well. And maybe it's in a good way. Maybe we get a blossoming in our regional centres. I don't know, but I think that's probably an area where that clustering effect really kind of adds fire to the creativity.
Thank you. And just on some of the benefits, I noticed in the chat here, Natasha has pointed out that as with someone with a disability, COVID has opened up a whole new world and other possibilities for people with disabilities that perhaps didn't exist before, as we've transitioned into this new way of working and thinking. Just on this question of work, and this goes to something that Andrew has spent a lot of time studying, and Genevieve, you're an expert in. Before the pandemic, I guess one of the most serious threats that people thought or imagined about work was this idea of this fear of the uncertainty of automation, of AI taking people's jobs, moving on. Has this pandemic and the responses to it? I noticed at least one supermarket chain is moving towards automating, stronger automation of their distribution centres. I mean, is this going to push us further down that track, or has it put a sort of halt to that sort of progress? I'd be interested in your view. Genevieve first, and then Andrew, I guess.
I think, like many impacts, it's been uneven, right? I think there's sort of a couple of pieces you want to tease apart, right? We have conversations about working from home, absolutely absent conversations about the jobs that don't work from home and about how that functions around education and school, because I'm acutely aware that many of the consequences of the last 3 months were felt very differently depending on where you were in a sort of sequence of life stages. If you were a parent with young kids, working from home felt like a very complicated act indeed. So I think there was sort of a piece about, it's easy to talk about working from home as though it were a singular monolithic thing, and I think it isn't. think we also need to talk about the kinds of jobs that can't be automated and the kinds of jobs that couldn't be done from home as a different part of the landscape. And then I think even if we look at the automation pieces, it's been really uneven, right? The places where Australians toggled very quickly to an uptake of digital services that had been a long time languishing, telemedicine would be one of them. You know, more than 10 years ago, when the government of the day put out their paper about a broadbanded nation with a 2020 end state, right? So think yourself back to 2010 and a very particular kind of promise of the NBN. We had said a whole series of things would have happened by 2020. If you had taken a snapshot in January 2020, you would have thought there's no way we're getting there. By June 2020, we're actually in much better shape. And it included things like the uptake of telemedicine, the number of Australians who have had some kind of appointment with their GP with a digital interface is a remarkable, like this sort of line. And I'm sure for a number of people, the prospect of being able to do certain kinds of services that way would actually be great. It's a whole lot of things you don't have to think about. You don't have to find parking. You don't have to navigate getting yourself into a doctor's surgery. There's all kinds of stuff about that that's kind of remarkable. We've also seen a real transition to digital payment services for a whole lot of people who weren't using them before. So the conversion from needing cash to using all the manner of digital sort of transition pieces there. So I think there's been places where the kind of toggle to digital services has been really quite startling over this period of time. And while there'll be some readoption of other things, I think there's been some stuff that's really happened there. In terms of thinking about what a more AI-like world would look like, listen, there's lots of things we'd have to do in Australia for that to be the case. It's not only how do you have a stable and 21st century network connectivity system, because you actually need that to make all of it work. It's also about working out where are the places it's going to be best. Turns out in Australia, we're already world leaders in using AI systems in mining in particular. If you go out west and you are looking at what FMG has done, or Rio or BHP, we're considered to be world leaders for the stuff we have in Australia. Similarly, in terms of certain kinds of agricultural production, we're doing things that are, again, considered to be kind of top of the line globally. In terms of some of the other pieces of AI, we are, in a different position, because you actually have to think about all of it, right? You have to think about a telecommunications network, an educational system, legislation and policy. You have to think about how not to just have this be part of a story about efficiency, but also a story about safety, sustainability, reliability, and all of those pieces are complicated. So when people say to me, oh, we just need more AI, I'm always like, okay, which AI are we talking about? And how do you do all the pieces to ensure that actually it makes sense here? And then, just as the kind of the footnote, I sometimes don't think it should be a footnote. I think it probably should be the leading line. One of the things we never talk about when we talk about AI is its cost, and not its monetary cost, but its cost in terms of energy and sustainability. So at the moment, so the state is a year old now, maybe even 2 years old, the server farms of the world, i.e. the things that make this platform possible in every app in your phone and every digital service you use, those data farms consumed about 10% of the world's energy budget. So a full 10%, 10. So then you think about what does it look like to imagine a world with more AI services and more AI in it. You have to imagine that energy budget is a floor, not a ceiling. And then you have to ask yourself the question, can we actually, in an environment where we need to think about sustainability, where we need to think about all of those things, you actually have to think about how would you do that in a manner that is more sustainable, energy efficient, and how do you start making those requests effectively that it should be like that.
And Andrew, your latest book is on sort of technology and how takeover of technology does not have to be inequitable and can be done in a more equitable way. So what do you think this period of time now, how has it changed the trajectory we were heading on already?
In terms of technology, I think we've suddenly jumped through to 2030. Just as in terms of globalisation, I think we've fallen back to 2010. What does technology do? Well, it really hits what economists call routine jobs. David Order describes 3 categories of jobs: manual jobs, think childcare workers and security guards; abstract jobs, think high-level legal work or academics; and then routine jobs, which involve tasks like bookkeeping that are possible to automate. Routine jobs have been hit pretty hard over the last generation, and I think they're going to be suffering even more as a result of a lot of these shifts we've seen. not just the artificial intelligence advances that Genevieve has talked about, which, for example, in the mining industry are taking away some of those routine jobs, but also the move to teleworking, where people will increasingly be doing more of those routine tasks themselves, perhaps aided by a digital assistant. One potentially good aspect to come out of this pandemic, though, is that I think we might see a move away from the open plan office. The open plan office, as most economic research has shown, is largely disastrous for productivity. People are most productive when they're not interrupted by others. We routinely overestimate our ability to do two tasks or our ability to concentrate in a crowded office. So the open plan office is the enemy of deep work, which is why in so many open plan offices, you don't see people sitting around and collaborating, you see them wearing noise cancelling headphones. Open plan offices have been put in place largely for economic reasons, because people who run the firms want to reduce the rent budget, and in some cases it's been downright hypocritical. The people making the decision to move to open plan offices have themselves kept their own offices, and they put everyone else into open plan. But the research doesn't seem to have changed the behaviour of some of the corporate leaders that have introduced open plan. So what it's taken is a pandemic which is clearly much more easily spread in an open plan office than in offices where people have doors. So we're going to see more working from home, but I hope to the extent that people are working in offices, that those offices are going to have the sort of quiet spaces that allow proper reflection and allow people really not just to do the work that is productive, but the work that's satisfying. We know that getting into a state of flow is enormously rewarding, whether you're working with your hands or with your brain. And in allowing people to engage in that sort of deep work is better done either at home or else in a proper office. So restoration of offices the way they should be could be a silver lining of a very dark cloud.
Right. Thank you, Andrew. And someone who quit an open plan office to go and work for a think tank, the death of the open plan office can't come soon enough for me. Before I want to go into how social capital might have changed as a part of COVID, but before we do that, someone in the chat, Genevieve, asked whether you might have any views on sort of this move to digital learning that we've seen over the course of the pandemic. Is this a permanent thing? I mean, it seemed in talking to lots of parents around my daughter's age from different schools that it was very school dependent. Some schools did it well, some schools did it very badly. So is it just something we did to get through so we could go back to school, or is there a greater place for this digital learning, particularly in schools?
I think you have to sort of tease out the difference between different pieces of the educational ecosystem. So what learning looks like in kindy and primary school, secondary school, university, and then other kinds of training. Each one of those is a really different relationship between instructors and students and parents in the community, and very different notions about what's being done, right? So are these forms of socializing you into being part and parcel of a community? Is it about transmitting particular skills? Is it about having to go through certain thresholds to demonstrate skill acquisition? And I think we sometimes forget that much of the function of most educational experiences isn't just about acquisition of skills, but also about socialization, about creating community and social contracts. And so the idea of everything being able to be digitally intermediated turns it into more of a broadcast activity. So we talk about personalized learning, and I often wonder what we're losing in that, because some learning, in fact, most learning is actually community and social, not individual to instructor. And so while it is certainly the case that there are a whole lot of things that function really well in this format, there are a lot of things that don't too. There's plenty of evidence to say that much learning is embodied. So you actually have to have your body in it. It's kinesthetic. We know there's different learning styles, and there's different things that work better in this format and not. My suspicion is one of the challenges we had over the last 3 months is that this wasn't just about digital learning. This was about asking parents, grandparents, and carers to suddenly become teachers, which is a very different proposition. If we then look at sort of, the university sector, well, there's some parts of the university sector that were designed 200 years ago the lecture. And it could probably do with an upgrade. So, you know, can I imagine a blended format where you have some things that can be delivered digitally? Sure. And Australia pioneered that. I mean, let's think back about the School of the Air. We worked out how to do remote and distant education using some of the most extraordinarily low tech, now we would think of technical services, but we worked out how to send workbooks ahead. We worked out how to have individual learning and collective learning. We worked out how to do collaboration. We thought about trust and sociability. But in order to make all of that work, you have to invest in the technology. You have to invest in teachers. You actually have to give them time to train and time to get good at things. You have to invest in the platforms. And I think you actually have to make room for the fact that not everything works as a virtual or digitally intermediated experience. So my suspicion is it's a blend, but thinking about getting it right over time requires a really subtle set of investments. And remembering that in this particular period of time, we asked parents to be part of the ecosystem in a way that they also weren't necessarily skilled to do.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. So a number of you raised in your opening questions this idea of you know, the social comedy in Australia, the sense of community that we found throughout the bushfires, and then going into this, people reconnecting with their communities in a way that I think we hadn't seen for a number of years. I'm going to start with you, Caitlin. Do you think this is a permanent shift, this new build-in social capital, or are we going to go back to being greedy individualists as soon as possible?
Well, I hope so. I mean, I think it hadn't died completely. I think the Australia does have this tradition of volunteerism. There are, you know, major institutions in Australia that are run by volunteers. We do have historically have a tradition of helping our mates, helping our neighbours. People used to help each other build their houses. And it has been eroded by, you know, by kind of modern society and trends of people working full time and so on. But it hasn't died completely. And I think it might be starting to make a resurgence, maybe not in the same way. We did see that collective spirit in the bushfires. We've seen it in the pandemic as well. I've seen Facebook groups with thousands and thousands of members coordinating to help people in their communities, to spread random acts of kindness, and, you know, not just on Facebook, but, you know, through all sorts of different platforms. So I think that's really important. It's a really important part of a functioning community, a functioning society. And I think it will be particularly important this century because of the kind of impending effects of climate change, that, you know, there's going to be more hard times to come, possibly more pandemics, more natural disasters. All of these things are predicted to increase. So the more that we can actually have a functioning community and help each other and get through, the better prepared we'll be to deal with that. And also the better prepared we'll be as individuals to deal with the kind of the anxiety and depression that comes along with that, with the kind of grim scenarios that are painted. They say that the best way to, that action and activism and, you know, whether it's going to a protest or whether it's just kind of helping people is the best way to psychologically deal with this as well as practically. So I really hope that that is something that continues. It's something we haven't seen as much of in other countries. So Australia can hold its head up there and hopefully we can help spread it to the rest of the world as well.
That's a great point. I'm going to put you on the spot now, Gabriel, as someone who straddles the Pacific. Because Caitlin's made a great point. You know, we have this in Australia where this sense of community spirit seems to have come up, whereas one could suggest that in the US this pandemic has simply done a lot to re-entrench polarization, not just political polarization, but polarization across society. I don't expect you to speak on behalf of 370 million Americans, but how do you see the differences in the two places?
Yeah, wow. Well, I'm going to write a book on this someday. Well, look, I send an update to America friends every couple of months, just kind of an email on what I've been observing and learning. And the last one I sent, an old friend wrote back and said, you know, I never realized how amazing it would be to just be a normal country. And this phrase, a normal country, this is kind of how Americans see Australia sometimes, like the government works. When you run a political campaign and you get elected, you kind of do what you said you were going to do. Um, it's that certainly the mythology Americans tell themselves is that they reject government, but they embrace community self-reliance. That's the American story it likes to tell about itself. But I think what maybe you see in Australia is that you need government to work in order to sort of create the framework for community-led efforts to thrive. You can't make up for deficits in governance through a volunteer approach, and so they actually go together.
Oh, fantastic. Andrew?
I really like Gabriel's point
Apply on America.
I really like Gabriel's point about the interaction between the two levels. I think we've seen that, for example, in the way in which food banks have operated in recent months. Food banks' business model is that we don't eat everything in the supermarkets, and then they pass that on to food banks, and then they distribute it to the needy. Trouble is, when the supermarket shelves are empty, there's nothing for food banks. So what was given to them went down 27%, and it took a while for the federal government to step into the breach as it needed to. But we do need to also have a greater sense of organic civil society. Nick Terrell and I are just putting the finishing touches in a book called Reconnected, a community builder's handbook, which will be out in September. And that tells a range of stories about how effective community organisations are bucking the trend of declining social capital, doing things like offering people dual purpose volunteering, where they get to get fit and clean up the environment at the same time, using technology not as a way of disconnecting us from others, but as a way of enhancing face-to-face connections. Caitlin mentioned before the terrific example of the bushfires, bringing out a sense of social solidarity, and how we managed to harness that civic energy after the disaster is over is a really big challenge, I believe. So there's a lot that we can do to build a more connected country. And as an egalitarian, I think this is absolutely critical. We've turned too much from a we society into an I society, from a more communitarian society to a more individualistic society. And I don't think it's a coincidence that at the very same time that we've seen a decline in civic life, we've also seen an increase in the gap between rich and poor. So if you're an egalitarian, I think you should be a communitarian at the same time. People like Linda White recognise this in her work in a union which doesn't just work to reduce the gap between rich and poor, but also to build a greater sense of camaraderie in a workplace, introduce the new person around, encourage the lunchtime games of soccer, increase the social glue in a workplace. The best unions are fighting the egalitarian fight and the communitarian fight at the same time.
Fantastic, thanks, Andrew. Genevieve, you in your opening comments mentioned, in fact, the bushfires and stuff. I mean, how do you see this playing out as we go forward, this renewed sense of community in Australia?
Also, as I said at the beginning, I think for me, one of the most interesting things to come out of that summer was a sense about the nature of our infrastructures. And I talked a lot at the beginning about the technical infrastructures, electricity, comms, those sort of things. But I think the other piece, to echo Caitlin and Andrew, that was really striking to me was the resilience of some of our social infrastructures. So whether they were our kind of complicated structures like the volunteer fire services, whether they were about very sort of local based tacit organizations who were providing a kind of a sense of we're in it together. There was something really quite remarkable about that. And much like Gabriel, I straddle my time between places, and I spent the better part of the last 30 years living in the US. And so I was traveling a lot at the beginning of this year and the end of last year. And my colleagues are still kind of in touch with me globally. And the question they were asking at Christmas time was a very different one than they ask now. So at Christmas, the conversation I was having with my peers more globally was basically one that said, please tell us you're not our future. Because if you remember back to January, which feels like such a long time ago now, Australia, the image of Australia globally was a country on fire, right? And I think for a lot of my peers, they looked at it and said, is this the future we all have because of climate change, right? And we were seen as being the kind of, are we the canary down the kind of the mine of global climate change? And they kept wanting to be told it was all going to be okay. And it's really hard to say that if you have both grown up in Australia and live here now. It's clearly not all going to be okay. And there are enormous challenges that we face in thinking about climate change, in thinking about sustainability, in thinking about what it means to live in that world. And I couldn't give people the comfort of going, no, it's all going to be fine, mate. You'll be great. It's all going to be good. 6 months later, the thing people keep saying to me now is, how is it that you all seem to be doing so quote unquote well? Which is an awful thing to say when I know we actually aren't doing well. We're just doing better than everyone, many other places that are doing far worse. So like, you know, it's an awkward kind of space, right? But what's startling in both instances is one of the pieces that was just so clear through the last 9 months was that Australia was in fact culturally quite different. You know, it may be easy to say we look and sound a little bit like America. We certainly sound more like it than we did in my childhood. We have many more facets of Americanness in our lives. And, you know, Andrew's right to point out the kind of move to an individualism from a collective society. But I think what was striking to me and is still striking to me is how much there is a collective impulse in Australia. We are still willing to act on behalf of something bigger than ourselves. Whether it's our family, our neighborhood, our community, our town, we still do that. Now, of course, the problem with that is that those haven't always been the best impulses either. So, you know, you'd want to bracket here and say, how do we think about 60 to 80,000 years of Indigenous presence in this place? How do we think about what it means to have unceded land that we occupy? How do we want to think about the insidious racism that ran through the last 3 months in terms of where we thought COVID came from and the language we used around that? How do we want to think about the fact that violence to women and children is endemic and worse in this particular moment because of the places that it's now invisible? So, but on the one hand, we can talk about being collective and we can talk about and have a certain kind of desire for that. But I think we also need to be mindful of the fact that the collective hasn't always been unequivocally good. It requires work too.
And I guess one of the, you know, we may see this uptick in social inclusion, and I hope so. But one of the, I think, things this pandemic has highlighted is I guess, the lack of economic inclusion and the fragility of a lot of work in Australia. So Andrew, I might start with you with a question about the fact, you know, how do you think if we go into a deep recession, and let's all hope we don't, but if we do, how do you see it in hastening changes in patterns of work and economic inclusion and the effect it's having? And I guess, how do we ensure that we don't end up with a more unequal society at the end of this?
Brett, I have to preface this comment by apologising to anyone who's brought kids onto the call, but I think the only way to answer this is through discussing David Graeber's book, Bullshit Jobs. And David makes a distinction between what he calls bullshit jobs, which are basically jobs which are not important, which are not adding value to the community, and shit jobs, which are jobs that really need to be done, like cleaning toilets, but are undervalued. And I think what's happened over the course of the last 6 months is we've discovered many people who thought that they were doing really important work are being reminded that they're in bullshit jobs, that the economy didn't need them. And hopefully that's going to propel many of those people to think about getting involved in work which is more deeply meaningful, the kind of work that you'll be really proud of when you're on your deathbed. But I think also it's incumbent on us to realise that many of the essential jobs have been undervalued and underpaid. And that, for example, running a restaurant sector in which a whole lot of people are touching food, based on an economic model in which when people are feeling unwell, they will miss out financially if they don't come into work is not a very healthy way of running our restaurants. And it might be smarter to extend sick leave to people who will get a whole lot of other people sick if they come to work when they're ill. We also need to recognise that the impact of the pandemic is going to be to increase inequality. This is coming in several ways. We're seeing already that the job losses are disproportionately in the lowest paid jobs. We're seeing an impact on young workers, which has already been highlighted by Caitlin in the conversation. And we're also seeing an impact in wealth. So who's pulling $20,000 out of their superannuation when the market is down? Well, it's those who can least afford it. And so superannuation balances in retirement are going to be more unequal as a result of what we're doing. And on top of that, just to add insult to injury, the government's put in place this home builder scheme, which requires that you spend at least $150,000 on a project and get going in 6 months. Well, who's doing that? Frankly, it's very affluent people who are going to do renovations anyway. So we're taking scarce taxpayer dollars and giving them to some of the most affluent Australians in order to do work that they would already have done. And so it doesn't even create jobs. So we need to think much more carefully as we go through the next year or two about how we push back against the increase in inequality. Genevieve mentioned before home learning. I'm really worried about the educational gap that's opening up between those who intensively homeschooled their kids and parents who just couldn't afford to be there, and so left kids on their devices or in front of TV for a number of months. That's widened the gap quite considerably, and other countries are looking at creative ways of dealing with that, such as intensive programs of tutoring for the most disadvantaged kids in order to make up the gap. But if inequality isn't at the heart of thinking about how we rebuild here, the country is going to be in real strife.
So one of the big areas where the current pandemic has shown up the fragility of work is in the disproportionate impact on female employees. So women in female-dominated industries have taken up the burden. They've been the ones at the front line of this a little bit in terms of nursing and supermarket workers and others. They've been the ones forced to put their health on the line to serve the rest of us while we've been at home. They're also the ones that have lost the most jobs in female-dominated industries through the closure of sort of hospitality and others which are female-dominated. Caitlin, you've written a bit about this. How do we use this moment as a way to push back on the idea that female industries are worth less? How do we use it as an opportunity to push forward on getting finally gender pay in equality?
I'll just put that point in a moment. I also very briefly want to acknowledge that it's Australia. The fact that Australia is doing so well is not only because of our communitarian response and as individuals and as communities, and even what our government does. Like, we do have the advantage of being an island and not having many cases before this was discovered. So just briefly want to acknowledge that. But yeah, moving on to the economy, it is affecting disproportionately young people, and women are the ones who are losing their employment. And I'm not altogether sure that we are going to have a reckoning that is going to lead to an increase in pay for female-dominated industries. I think we saw like nurses work through the pandemic and then had their pay frozen. Now, I'm obviously completely neutral on that subject as a journalist, but I think it's factually is a sign that X plus Y does not necessarily lead to Z. So we can applaud them on Australia Day apparently, but in terms of actually doing structural change, I'm not sure where that push is going to come from.
Okay, thank you. So I am conscious of the time, and I'm conscious that we try and finish up at 1 o'clock, even though I suspect we could keep talking for hours yet. So I've got two questions I want to end on. The first one is a bit of fun. Those of us again who were lucky to have jobs and lucky to have a greater work-life balance because we didn't have to commute long. A lot of us have been watching things on Netflix, a whole new range of movies, TV shows, whatever. And at the start of the pandemic, one of the most downloaded movies was Contagion. I think people wanted to know whether that was going to be a handbook for how we get out of it. And the subtitle of Andrew's most recent book was How Do We Create a Future More Star Trek Than the Terminator? So I guess the question for everyone in the panel, and I might start with you, Gabriel, is there a movie that you would say that creates a convincing picture of our future?
Well, my mind is going to the remake of The Road Warrior, and look, and I say that. So I just opened some of the chat, and there's been a running commentary about climate change in the dialogue this whole session. And that hasn't been the focus of today's event, but it's the focus of what so many of us are thinking about. And look, I don't want that to be a convincing picture of the future, but I do think that Australia is one of the most climate exposed countries in the world. And for whatever reason, it hasn't been able to make the turn that the UK has made, where the Tories have become a party of climate action, and in a sense have made it be a bipartisan issue, and that just hasn't happened in Australia. And I'm still learning what all the reasons are for that, why it's going in this particular direction. But I worry for Australia about climate so much.
Andrew?
Look, it's a couple of years old now, Brett, but I think Black Panther really speaks to a new, much more inclusive genre of action movies. Getting away from that whole idea that an action movie is a bunch of white guys punching other white guys, to tell a big and exciting story. And this is a year in which we'll look back to coronavirus, but it's also a year in which we'll look back to the killing of George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter protests, and the way in which that's just rippling through all aspects of the culture in, I think, fundamentally good ways. So if we churn out a Black Panther every year, if we start to rethink a whole lot of these stereotypes about who are our heroes and villains in society, that'd be a great thing.
Fantastic. Genevieve?
I could happily do the Black Panther salute, but listen, if you wanted one that felt like our future, as someone who writes about science fiction a lot, I think one of the things that science fiction tells you about is not the future, but about the preoccupations of the present. And most science fiction is really just a story about now, but with some sort of imagination to the through line. I'm, of course, old enough to think that it's always Blade Runner. Like, I just think that, like, it's always Blade Runner. And I obviously mean the director's cut, always Blade Runner. But, that's not helpful. The only thing about it that's remarkable is that, Scott understood even then that it was going to be advertising. I think the one for me that is the most provocative recently is a British miniseries that came out in 2008 called The Last Enemy. And it had Benedict Cumberbatch before he was Sherlock. So no one remembers this because he became Sherlock shortly thereafter, but it is a remarkable, I think it's got 4 or 5 episodes, and it's basically the future as the future really will be, which is basically exactly like the present, but with more blinky lights on things. And an entire one around the use of data and surveillance technology. And it's differently dystopic than Black Mirror. And I thought it was really smart for its kind of critique about how you think about power, surveillance, data, and the relationship between those. And it's set in an urban setting. And it's also kind of got an interesting thread about national security and terrorism running through it. That sounds like a film review, but really the answer is just Blade Runner.
Caitlin, do you have a more uplifting movie that might be our future than what Gabriel and Genevieve have focused on?
Well, I did just rewatch with my children on the weekend Wall-E. So no, that was I'm sorry. Obviously these things don't pan out exactly, but I think that the big challenge this century is, that's got two themes, doesn't it? The environmental theme and also the kind of ceding human independence to machines. And I think those are two very big trends of the 21st century. And I don't think it will pan out in quite that way, but it's certainly kind of, I think, speaks to what we have to deal with and what we need to kind of not make our future.
Okay, one last question to everybody. What is the one thing about the way we used to do things that you don't want brought back after COVID? Or it could be Collingwood. You might not want Collingwood brought back. But, the one thing. So I might start with you, Andrew.
The open plan office.
Excellent. Gabriel?
Yeah, I was just thinking about commuting every day. Like what a waste of time that was for me personally, with all of my ambivalence about working together. I'm happy if that doesn't come back.
Caitlin?
Poker machines.
I think they're back already, unfortunately.
Yeah, probably. The handshake.
The handshake.
I don't mind shaking hands, but it's always that awkward thing of like, are we going to shake hands? Are we not going to shake hands? Are they going to crush my hands or prove their manliness? Are they going to go in for a kiss on the cheek or both cheeks? They're just, we can just wave and smile.
Genevieve, the last word.
One thing I hope doesn't come back, I hope we don't forget what we learned in the pandemic, which is I hope we don't go back to blithely just imagining that things turn up and that sitting behind them is no labor, no supply chain, no complexity of relationships. I hope we never go back to pretending we didn't know.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all. It is 1 o'clock and we do to get people off and having their lunch. Thank you all so much. Thank you everybody for joining in. I really appreciate it. And please give a virtual claps to our awesome panel of Genevieve, Gabriel, Andrew, and Caitlin. It's been a fantastic conversation. And our next one will be in about a week and a half on the 16th of July. So thanks, everybody. Have a great
Thank you.
Stay safe.
Thanks, Brett. Thanks, everyone.